Hello everyone, today we read and comment the third chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. If we cast a glance at the variety to be observed in the human character in respect to feeling, we find first some people were very little excitability were called phlegmatic or indolent. Secondly, some very excitable, but whose feelings still never overstep certain limits, and who are therefore known as men full of feeling but sober-minded. Thirdly, those who are very easily aroused, whose feelings blaze up quickly and violently like gunpowder, but do not last. Fourthly and lastly, those who cannot be moved by slight causes and who generally are not to be aroused suddenly, but only gradually. But whose feelings become very powerful and are much more lasting. These are men with strong passions lying deep and latent. This difference of character lies probably close on the confines of the physical powers which move the human organism and belongs to that amphibious organization which we call the nervous system, which appears to be partly material, partly spiritual. With our weak philosophy, we shall not proceed further in this mysterious field, but it is important for us to spend a moment over the effects which these different natures have on action in war, and to see how far a great strength of mind is to be expected from them. Indolent men cannot easily be thrown out their equanimity, but we cannot certainly say there is strength of mind where there is a want of all manifestation of power. At the same time, it is not to be denied that such men have a certain peculiar aptitude for war on account of their constant equanimity. They often want the positive motive to action, impulse, and consequently activity, but they are not apt to throw things into disorder. The peculiarity of the second class is that they are easily excited to act on trifling grounds, but in great matters they are easily overwhelmed. Men of this kind show great activity in helping an unfortunate individual, but by the distress of a whole nation they are only inclined to despond, not roused to action. Such people are not deficient in either activity or equanimity in war, but they will never accomplish anything great unless a great intellectual force furnishes the motive, and it is seldom that a strong independent mind is combined with such a character. Excitable, inflammable feelings are in themselves little suited for practical life, and therefore they are not very fit for war. They have certainly the advantage of strong impulses, but that cannot long sustain them. At the same time, if the excitability in such men takes the direction of courage or a sense of honor, they may often be very useful in inferior positions in war, because the action in war over which commanders in inferior positions have control is generally of shorter duration. Here one courageous resolution, one effervescence of the forces of the soul will often suffice. A brave attack, a soul-stirring hooray, is the work of few moments, whilst the brave content on the battlefield is the work of a day, and a campaign the work of a year. Owing to the rapid movement of their feelings, it is doubtless difficult for men of this description to preserve equilibrium of the mind. Therefore, they frequently lose head, and that is the worst phase in their nature as respects the conduct of war. But it would be the contrary to experience to maintain that very excitable spirits can never preserve a steady equilibrium, that is to say, that they cannot do so even under the strongest excitement. Why should they not have the sentiment of self-respect, for, as a rule, they are men of a noble nature? This feeling is seldom wanting in them, but it has not time to produce an effect. After an outburst, they suffer most from a feeling of inward humiliation. If through education, self-observance, and experience in life they have learned, sooner or later, the means of being on their guard, so that at the moment of powerful excitement they are conscious betimes of the counteracting force within their own breasts, then even such men may have great strength of mind. Lastly, those who are difficult to move, but on that account susceptible of very deep feelings, men who stand in the same relation to the preceding as red heat to a flame, are the best adapted by means of their titanic strength to roll away the enormous masses, by which we may figuratively represent the difficulties which beset command in war. The effect of their feelings is like the movement of a great body, slower but more irresistible. Although such men are not so likely to be suddenly surprised by their feelings and carried away so as to be afterwards ashamed of themselves, like the preceding, still it would be contrary to experience to believe that they can never lose their equanimity, or be overcome by blind passion. On the contrary, this must always happen whenever the noble pride of self-control is wanting, or as often as it has not sufficient weight. We see examples of this most frequently in men of noble minds belonging to savage nations, where the low degree of mental cultivation favors always the dominance of the passions. But even amongst the most civilized classes in civilized states, life is full of examples of this kind, of men carried away by the violence of their passions, like the poacher of old chained to the stag in the forest. We therefore say once more, strong mind is not one that is merely susceptible of strong excitement, but one which can maintain its serenity under the most powerful excitement, so that in spite of the storm in the breast, the perception and judgment can act with perfect freedom, like the needle of the compass in the storm-tossed ship. By the term strength of character, simply character is denoted tenacity of conviction, let it be the result of our own or of others' views, and whether their principles, opinions, momentary inspirations, or any kind of emanations of the understanding. But this kind of firmness certainly cannot manifest itself if the views themselves are subject to frequent change. This frequent change need not to be the consequence of external influences. It may proceed from the continuous activity of our own mind, in which case it indicates a characteristic unsteadiness of mind. Evidently, we should not say of a man who changes his views every moment, however much the motives of change may originate with himself, that he has a character. Only those men, therefore, can be said to have this quality whose conviction is very constant, either because it is deeply rooted and clear in itself, little liable to alteration, or because, as in the case of indolent men, there is a want of mental activity, and therefore a want of motives to change. Or lastly, because an explicitly active mind, derived from an imperative maxim of the understanding, refuses any change of opinion up to a certain point. Now, in war, owing to the many and powerful impressions to which the mind is exposed, and in uncertainty of all knowledge and of all science, more things occur to distract a man from the road he has entered upon, to make him doubt himself and others, than in any other human activity. The harrowing sight of danger and the suffering easily leads to the feelings gaining ascendancy over the conviction of the understanding. And in the twilight which surrounds everything, a deep, clear view is so difficult that a change of opinion is more conceivable and more pardonable. It is, at all times, only conjecture or guesses at truth which we have to act upon. This is why differences of opinion are nowhere so great as in war, and the stream of impressions acting counter to one's own convictions never ceases to flow. Even the greatest impassibility of mind is hardly proof against them, because the impressions are powerful in their nature and always act at the same time upon the feelings. When the discernment is clear and deep, known but the general principles and views of action from a high standpoint can be the result. And on these principles the opinion in each particular case immediately under consideration lies, as it were, at anchor. But to keep to these results of bygone reflection, in opposition to the stream of opinions and phenomena which they present brings with it, is just a difficulty. Between the particular case and the principle there is often a wide space which cannot always be traversed on a visible chain of conclusions, and where a certain faith in self is necessary and a certain amount of skepticism is serviceable. Here often nothing else will help us but an impressive maxim which, independent of reflection, at once controls it. That maxim is, in all doubtful cases, to adhere to the first opinion, and not to give it up until a clear conviction forces us to do so. We must firmly believe in the superior authority of well-tried maxims, and under the dazzling influence of a momentary events, not forget that their value is of an inferior stamp. By this preference, which in doubtful cases we give to the first convictions, by adherence to the same of our actions acquire that stability and consistency which make up what is called character. It is easy to see how essential and well-balanced mind is to strength of character. Therefore, men of strong minds generally have a great deal of character. Force of character leads us to a spurious variety of it. Obstinacy. It is often very difficult in concrete cases to say where the one ends and the other begins. On the other hand, it does not seem difficult to determine the difference in idea. Obstinacy is no fault of the understanding. We use the term as denoting a resistance against our better judgment, and it would be inconsistent to charge that to the understanding, as the understanding is the power of judgment. Obstinacy is a fault of the feelings or heart. This inflexibility of will, this impatience of contradiction, have their origin only in a particular kind of egotism, which sets above every other pleasure, that of governing both self and other by its own mind alone. We should call it a kind of vanity, were it not decidedly something better. Vanity is satisfied with mere show, but obstinacy rests upon the enjoyment of the thing. We say, therefore, force of character degenerates into obstinacy whenever the resistance to opposing judgments proceeds not from better convictions or a reliance upon a trustworthy maxim, but from a feeling of opposition. If this definition, as we have already admitted, is of little assistance practically, still it will prevent obstinacy from being considered merely force of character intensified, whilst it is something essentially different, something which certainly lies close to it and is cognate to it, but is at the same time so little an intensification of it that there are very obstinate men, from want of understanding, have very little force of character. So, this is one of my favorite passages from the Vom Kriege, actually, because there is, as you have heard, a very thorough understanding of human soul, characters, personalities, and it's kind of funny even to look through yourself on the base of these patterns, and let's simply go on. So with the explanation. So von Clausewitz here says, if we cast a glance at the variety to be observed in human character, not in respect to feeling, we find first, and this is the first type of person, some people who have very little excitability were called phlegmatic or indolent, right? So these people are not easily excited in general. So secondly, some others are instead very excitable. This is second class, but their feelings still never overstep certain limits and are therefore known as men full of feeling but sober-minded, right? Thirdly, third class, those who are very easily aroused, whose feelings blaze up quickly and violently like gunpowder, but do not last. Fourthly, and lastly, those who cannot be moved by slight causes and who generally are not to be aroused suddenly, but only gradually, but whose feelings become very powerful and are much more lasting. These are men with strong passions lying deep and latent. So this is very interesting because it's based fundamentally on two axes, right? The first one is how excitable you are, and the second one is how much of this lays in potential or is immediately expandable. So von Clausewitz goes on and says this difference of character lies probably close on the confines of the physical powers which move the human organism, and belongs to that amphibious organization which we call the nervous system, which appears to be partly material, partly spiritual, right? And this is, in fact, it says, with our weak philosophy, we shall not proceed further in this mysterious field, which is interesting for a man writing in the early 19th century. But it's true, we haven't still figured out substantially what is, due to, it's a bit between free will and determinism, right? How much of our action is determined by just how we're programmed, and also how we can do autonomously. And so von Clausewitz says he understood intelligently that this is beyond our comprehension, but at least by certain standards, and that it doesn't really matter. What matters is here things happen. Always remember, von Clausewitz is interested, has very pragmatic interests, so he is not superficial in this matter because there is much to know. He only observes that fundamentally this is how things work, and then we have to see how they are declined according to the situation. And in fact, he says, but it is important for us to spend a moment over the effects which these different natures have on action in war, and to see how far a great strength of mind is to be expected from them, right? So these four classes, right, of people, how do they really work in war, right? And this is a complete, obviously approximate, as every individual is different, but we know that there are certain these types of categorizations that encompass the whole human population. So looking at the first, the indolent man, right? One cannot easily, they cannot be easily thrown out of their equanimity, but we cannot certainly say there is strength of mind where there is a want of all manifestation of power, right? So that this might even be, the fact that you're fundamentally phlegmatic or indolent may even mean that you have a sort of balance mentally, etc. But if you don't manifest power, how it's gonna work at the end of the day. And in fact, here it says, at the same time, it is not to be denied that such men have a certain peculiar aptitude for war, on account of their constant equanimity, right? They often want the positive motive to action, impulse, and consequently activity, but they are not apt to throw things into disorder. So it can help, right? But it's not necessarily what is gonna solve this otherwise very bold what it takes to solve certain problems in war. It's also this elements of courage, of excitement that is needed to take action, is part of the resolution, as we have seen in the previous paragraphs. So passing to the second class, it says the second class has a peculiarity that basically these people are easily excited to act on trifling grounds, but in great matters they are easily overwhelmed, right? Men of this kind show great activity in helping an unfortunate individual, but by the distress of a whole nation they are only inclined to despond, not roused to action. So these are the people that have maybe, they're very maybe human, very generous, very even kind-hearted, that they help, as the example here, the individual we see in front of them, but they don't there is a sort of level beyond which they don't go, right? So and I can think of people I know in this kind, and we are all partly, we all partly have this attitude that we're not excessively projected, at least towards certain bigger issues that are there, are eventually important, but we tend not to care. But maybe we could help, or maybe we think to be particularly cynical, but when we see someone in trouble, we help them, right? That's the general idea, but yet that's not enough, because it's kind of temporary, right? It's kind of circumscribed, and there is not a far greater commitment and excitement to be found over time. Von Clausewitz says such people, in fact, are not deficient in either activity or equanimity in war, but they will never accomplish anything great unless a great intellectual force furnishes the motive, and it is very seldom that a strong independent mind is combined with such a character, right? So this is also important. So it's fairly rare that people who don't get excited for fundamentally a bigger issue, right? That they're living a bit on the journey. What they see, that can have this enormous commitment, even just from an intellectual level, and having this strong independent mind at the same time. At least it's rare to find. Then passing to the third group, excitable, inflammable feelings are in themselves little suited for practical life, and therefore they're not very fit for war. They have certainly the advantage of strong impulses, but that cannot long sustain them. At the same time, if the excitability in such men takes the direction of courage or a sense of honor, they may often be very useful in inferior positions in war, because the action in war over which commanders in inferior positions have control is generally of shorter duration. Here, one courageous resolution, one fervence of the forces of the soul will often suffice. A brave attack, a soul-stirring array, is the work of a few moments, whilst a brave contest on the battlefield is the work of a day, and a campaign the work of a year. This is very, very important. Here it says von Clausewitz doesn't have a great sympathy, obviously, towards this group, because inflammable feelings are kind of unhelpful, right? It's what our society is turning into, basically. Just shouting and not shutting the hell up and think. And therefore these strong impulses that are kind of even difficult to contain in part can even find a sort of application, but it doesn't last for much. It's really based on the feeling, on the impulse, and not on something else. But there are certain conditions, though, in which maybe a certain particular direction of courage or a sense of honor, right, can make these individuals work rather well for certain limited commitment, shorter duration in these inferior positions as commanders, but in kind of small actions, right, that can be accomplished through this one courageous resolution, one effervescence of the forces of the soul, right, in which von Clausewitz says will often suffice, right. So a brave attack, a soul-stirring array, is the work of a few moments, and yet this has limits, because whilst a brave contest on the battlefield is the work of a day, a campaign is the work of a year. So even such long excitement is difficult to bear at those levels, and studying military history, you see really how much you must take a commitment, a resolution that goes far beyond the excitements of the passions, and everything is something so much more much more complexly driven than just this. So it's a campaign is the work of something that you also have to you have a pressure, right, that is on yourself, that consumes you, that is going on day after day after day. So you need a lot of commitment that if that vanishes just in a few hours, let's say, it doesn't quite or even less, by the way, doesn't quite fit this broader picture, if not in fact in these lower positions, right? But this doesn't work for bigger, let's say, scenarios. Owing the rapid movement of their feelings, it is doubly difficult for man of this description to preserve equilibrium of the mind. Right? It's obvious. Therefore, they frequently lose head, and that is the worst phase in their nature as respects to the conduct of war. But it would be contrary to experience to maintain that very excitable spirits can never preserve a steady equilibrium. That is to say, that they cannot do so even during the strongest excitement. Why should they not have the sentiment of self-respect, for as a rule they are men of a noble nature? This feeling is seldom wanting in them, but it has not time to produce an effect. That's the point. After an outburst, they suffer most from a feeling of inward humiliation. So, even though, there can be a balance over time, so that, for example, they are driven by this courage sometimes, that is part of what resolution takes. But the problem is that even, this feeling is at the same time has not time to produce a more durable effect, right? After they have this outburst, they tend to go the other direction, to have this sort of inward humiliation. Now, this is interesting because this is what happens actually to everyone by a certain degree. So here von Clausewitz is sort of characterizing on the base on how much this is accentuated, right? Yet there is another option. It says here that about this third group, that says if through education, self-observance, and experience of life they have learned sooner or later the means of being on their guard, right, so that at the moment of powerful excitement they are conscious betimes of the counteracting force within their own breasts, then even such men may have great strength of mind. Because basically, once you get burned once and two or thrice and more, you can have some sort of, you can work on it fundamentally. You can start to stem your emotions and kind of helping them to support the thing more gradually, right? And therefore putting on, let's say, into play that decent amount of spirit that you're required to have a great strain of mind and being very reliable in many ways. So it's a matter of maintaining self-control. Then the fourth group says, lastly, those who are difficult to move, but on that account susceptible of very deep feelings, men who stand in their same relation to the preceding as red heat to a flame, are the best adapted by means of their titanic strength to roll away the enormous masses by which we may figuratively represent the difficulties which beset command in war. The effect of their feelings is like the movement of a great body, slower but more irresistible. So there's a concept of inertia here. So this guy seems to stay, bit detached from the situation, but still something is growing within them, and is pushing them, and it pushes them far, because it's as if it had a greater impression. I mean, it doesn't exhaust itself, it doesn't burn immediate resources, but on the long run, well, that's where you can achieve really big stuff, because they're let's say pushed, they're fueled by something really that goes beyond what the small pushes, let's say, of the small influences and trivial things. Maybe could excite so much the one of the third group, but this one doesn't have an impact on them. But on the long run, when you manage to hidden them from the within, they they produce this very irresistible force. So, although, von Clausewitz continues, although such men are not so likely to be suddenly surprised by their feelings and carried away so as to be afterwards ashamed of themselves, like the preceding, still it would be contrary to experience to believe that they can never lose their equanimity, or be overcome by blind passion. On the contrary, this must always happen whenever the noble pride of self-control is wanting, or as often as it has not sufficient weight. So this is important because still in the process these guys cannot feel. Here we're talking about feelings. This is interesting about the story here. It's not about self-control properly. These are all things you can use to check this. But here we are talking fundamentally about feelings, excitement. Nothing else in practice. But so this element of this most noble pride of self-control can be either deficient or excessive, so that these individuals, in spite of their more granitic approach to external influences, once they're put in motion, are more difficult to stem. Like these blind passions can overcome them as well, and arguably probably they're more difficult to bring back. Von Clausewitz says, in fact, we see examples of this most frequently in men and noble minds belonging to savage nations, where the low degree of mental cultivation favors always the dominance of the passions, right? This is interesting because it basically says that, remember, von Clausewitz has basically said that war it stems mostly from the intellect, right? So that more or less developed civilizations basically have this more or less powerful, this more or less powerful capability of fighting wars, because they essentially have a different level of reason, intellectual development. So here maybe what von Clausewitz looks at these primitive societies and saying, that there are certain chieftains that, let's assume that they are maybe this they fall into this fourth category, but they tend basically to lose their temper, to be overwhelmed by passions, and therefore and to ruin everything at the end of the day, because they haven't developed enough their intellectual skills. So basically they lack this element, and they tend to make inconsiderate decisions, let's put it in this way, and to ruin actually the good base that they would have otherwise. So von Clausewitz says then, although such we already read this. I was saying that, but even amongst the most civilized classes in civilized states, life is full of examples of this kind of men carried away by the violence of their passions, like the poacher of old chained to the stag in the forest, right? So here von Clausewitz, uses terms that definitely belong to a 19th century context, but, he's not saying that these societies are bad, or they're not, because basically looking at the most developed ones, even in the West, even in most civilized states, there is the guy where he's kind of overwhelmed by passions among these people, and is carried away by the violence of these feelings, like the poacher of old chained to the stag in the forest, right? So very, kind of even a ridiculous comparison in the sense that, that they're completely carried away. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, we therefore say once more, a strong mind is not one that is merely susceptible of strong excitement, but one which can maintain its serenity under the most powerful excitement, so that, in spite of the storm in the breast, the perception and judgment can act with perfect freedom, like the needle of the compass in the storm-tossed ship. Now this is particularly important because it really makes you understand where he was aiming at. I mean, the concept is in war, what you really need is, you can't do without, we already seen it in the previous videos, you can't do without intelligence, first of all. That is the most important thing, and here is this serenity and perception and judgment, right? But still you need this very strong excitement, I mean, to carry out very, dangerous stuff that takes a lot of courage and bold decisions, etc. So that the first one, however, does not become overwhelmed by the latter, right? Like the needle of the compass in the storm-tossed ship, right? So you can't take the ship everywhere, but as long as the compass points in the direction, you know exactly what you have to do, right? And it's way more complicated than it seems, because especially under certain pressure, we as humans, we tend to lose our temper, right? And that's why also in positions of command, basically the most important aspect is to be fundamentally detached from that direct pressure, right? So tendentially, that's why these are the people who tend to become the great military commanders at the end of the day. And we have seen that the passions in here are not at this point are come as a disturbing element from within you, so that the more you rise up to the ranks, it's not that things get easier because you're not under enemy fire directly and you decide things from the distance on what to do, but actually your responsibility grows, and this is a pretty heavy storm within your soul. So it's particularly important to realize that it's a struggle with yourself, right? Von Clausewitz goes on and says, by the term strength of character, or simply character, is denoted tenacity of conviction. Let it be the result of our own or others, or of others' views, and whether they are principles, opinions, momentary inspirations, or any kind of emanations of the understanding. But this kind of firmness certainly cannot manifest itself if the views themselves are subject to frequent change, right? So the problem with this strength of character that we have researched at this point through these groups and that we had been defining in the previous videos is something that, however, doesn't remain statically. The situation change. So here von Clausewitz is starting to stress the importance on how the perception around us, really, of what surrounds us, has on ourselves, and how this can, really seriously challenge strength of character, right? Because strength of character is also modulated on the base of not just of nature feelings that we have seen now, but also of of contradicting or incomplete, at least, data that we have to read through and in order to make a decision. Otherwise we can't even have a strength of character, but not being able to apply it in the moment we need it. And sometimes this is justified, because if you receive lots of let's say informations, let's say they're false, but you don't know it, and that's all the evidence that you have, you're brought to fail, and therefore, well, I'm trying to simplify it here, but that's an example how even the strength of character didn't bring you everywhere. But that's because I'm simplifying that you understand that this is way more shaded in action than in any other activity. And now this is what von Clausewitz is talking about. In fact, he goes on and says, this frequent change need not to be the consequence of external influences. It may proceed from the continuous activity of our own mind, in which case it indicates a characteristics unsteadiness of mind, right? So that's really arguably the greatest part of the problem. How do we react to these contradicting factors? You have to be steady with your convictions, even when they seem to be wrong. And you say, well, that really doesn't sound. I mean, how can you know? Well, that's what also the point really is. Let's see now what he says. Evidently, we should not say of a man who changes his views every moment, however much the motives of change may originate within himself, that he has character, right? I mean, that's kind of schizophrenic, right? Only those men, therefore, can be said to have this quality whose conviction is very constant, either because it is deeply rooted and clear in itself, little liable to alteration, or because, as in the case of indolent men, there is a want of mental activity and therefore a want of motives to change. Or, lastly, because an explicit act of the will, derived from the imperative maxim of the understanding, refuses any change of opinion up to a certain point. So he basically says that there are ways this can be obviated to, but also here not necessarily for the best, in the sense that you can't have a kind of steady mind if you don't have kind of a great mental activity, which happens freaking a lot of time. I mean, a great problem, but I wouldn't make you understand this is not really a stereotypization. Like it's only explaining to you. It's not that he's talking about actual people. He's talking about the mechanism behind that. We all suffer of this basically. So that if you, for example, if you don't know how something works, and assume you have to do something that requires, in order to be achieved, to know how that something works, and you don't, well, you may keep doing the same thing without really changing anything, right? But that's kind of a lack of mental activity, because you don't even know that the damn thing works in that way in the first place. Or because, for example, you have this very strong cognitive or intellectual certainty, so that you want to stick to it at every cost, or maybe sometimes it's a sensible thing to do, right? Or simply because there is a character that for which you tend to be steady, right? You don't get altered more than much for whatever reason. Now, Von Clausewitz says, now in war, owing to the many and powerful impressions to which the mind is exposed, and in the uncertainty of all knowledge and of all science, more things occur to distract a man from the road he has entered upon, to make him doubt himself and others, than in any other human activity. So, let's say, war has this primacy of mass, of total mass, that basically brings, like in no other human activity, to changing opinion, right? And this is kind of obvious. I mean, the more you're put under stress and the more your brain is working, because it's really confronted with the real challenge, which it's trying to solve, and that has necessarily to find a way out. If you're risking your life, that's what essentially you do. But at the same time, since so much is at stake, you tend to take everything into consideration. That can further mess up things because you don't know what to do. And that's really the greatest problem of war, because everything can influence you at that point. It can come from within you, it can come from the surrounding environment, it can come from other people's impressions that also have this massive influence on you. So von Clausewitz says, the harrowing sight of danger and suffering easily leads to the feelings gaining ascendancy over the conviction of the understanding. And in the twilight which surrounds everything, a deep clear view is so difficult that a change of opinion is more conceivable and more pardonable, right? So there is this tendency to, when you're under, in front of danger, to have these feelings increasing in importance within you. This is particularly important because actually intelligence also starts to work more, but feelings are more immediate, have this greater impact on you, And so what happens at that point is that you tend to a bit to convince yourself, or to let yourself being convinced by either them or whatever impression is here. So what von Clausewitz is saying is that a clear view of the situation, that is what you really need, is tendentially discarded by instinct, I would say, in this particular context, so that you say it's in a matter of responsibility. I mean, that guy told me to do that because I was under very heavy pressure, and I did it. Right? How many times this is used as an excuse, but this is still whatever reasons you may have had, but still things presumably got if not bad, at least they might have gone bad because you were not really responding to on the base of evidence, but just because you felt in a certain way. So Clausewitz says it is so in fact, by the way, excuse me, I wanted to end this phrase also, that for Clausewitz noticed this, is that this last idea is more conceivable and more pardonable. So this is also kind of socially accepted, right? That guy was freaking out, so did something incredibly stupid. Well, might have committed some damage fundamentally, made some damage, but maybe he's partly excused because he was under pressure, right? You can't naturally, and partly at least, condone, but also it's not really a positive thing at the end of the day because it's driving away from reason, but still conceivable. It's still kind of plausible and makes sense because we know that humans do this on average. So going on, for Clausewitz writes, it is at all times only conjecture or guesses at truth which we have to act upon. And this is also dramatically important because in war especially we have seen that it's the realm of danger, of chance, of unpredictability, right? Remember what von Clausewitz says, that basically the decision in war is taken on the base of basically only on an awareness of the situation that basically never exceeds 25% of how things really are, most of the times, right? So it's normal that we have to conjecture, we have to guess, and the whole thing is based at the end of the day on this. And it is to be taken into account in general, because that's really the main problem that von Clausewitz is pointing out, is that we had a perfect knowledge of everything, we wouldn't need to matter, to care about feelings. But feelings are also important in order to cope with certain situations. And this is what he will now, he's been explaining to us, and he will keep doing. So the conjecture and the guess is important at the same time. And here von Clausewitz will explain how you have to deal with this, how you have to deal with this limit, and the fact that and how you have to behave in front of such an astonishingly shortage of evidence, lack of evidence, in which you have to take dreadfully responsible choices on yourself. So he writes again, this is why differences of opinion are nowhere so great as in war, and the stream of impressions acting counter to one's own convictions never ceases to flow. So, in other words, what happens in war is that not only you have these problems, but that you tend normally, and other people, this is probably one of the most important things, tend to change opinion, and you on the base of them. So this is also another, because this is the idea, is that your convictions never ceases to flow, right? Think about some dangerous situation, whatever it is, right? And think how all the times you you got worried, and you're constantly worried, and you're constantly thinking and reframe the thing and recapitulate everything in order to be safer, right? And just imagine this in a situation in which you're bombarded literally with new data that arrives that is dramatically complicated to analyze. So you can clearly understand why war cannot be science, not even if we wanted this, because it can't be measured in that way, it can't be calculated rationally, right? For even at limits, both of the physical world, but also, because of feelings, because of emotions, right? Von Clausewitz says, even the greatest impassibility of mind is hardly proof against them, because the impressions are powerful in their nature and always act at the same time upon the feelings. I think this phrase is very important when you think about military history and you evaluate the skill of commanders. There is this widespread prejudice for which, a leader is there are leaders at least who are so effective, so cool, they won, they smashed the enemy, they're big guys, they had to win anyway. There is this idea, this partly stems from kind of fanboyism, or this, idea that you have to take sides into story and etc. But the problem is that nobody really has the way to win positively in this process. I mean, you can have some advantages, some edges. I mean, it's obvious that great commanders most of the times are freaking capable people, right? Because if they win time over time, I mean, you have to take that into consideration. Most likely, we will never know up to which point, in the sense that the outcome of battle is dramatically difficult to understand. You can't deal with war like as if it was a football match and simply assessing, because not even a football match is all about that. There is also a lot of luck involved, and certain things you can barely control. And obviously, a football match is childishly simpler than anything remotely close to what a war is, right? So it's the way we tell the story, like saying that guy was the best and knew what was doing. Well, fundamentally, most of the times, is not really known. Even some of the greatest battles, but even in recent times, about conflicts that we know actually a pretty big deal about, cannot be interpreted like that, because you don't know what that guy was thinking for real, right? You can have maybe even just, I don't know, diaries and stuff, but still that's not what at every second this person thought, and everything changes that fast, right? So here, even the greatest impassibility of mind is hardly proof against this eternal alternation, I would say, of opinions, of convictions, right? Everybody's undecided. And it takes a heavy toll to be also in that kind of situation, because it's consuming, right? And these okay, and these things are feelings driven, right? It's not about pure rationality. It's most of the times about feelings, because they are the same feelings that alert you. I mean, the reason why your mind starts spinning so much, so that in situations, conditions of danger, you're triggered immediately by danger through feelings, but also your mind starts spinning, right? Making its rational work. It's very meaningful in terms of what you should be doing at the moment, so that you need both. Now, the problem with this is that war in our society is something kind of very artificial. It's something very, very complicated, that our mind is not shaped, evolutionarily speaking, to dominate in its entirety. That's where the main problem comes. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, when the discernment is clear and deep, known but general principles and views of action from a high standpoint can be the result, right? So here, this phrase means that in most of cases, there are just very few leading principles, let's say, you have to stand on, that are clear and deep, right? A very few ones. And that is fine to have them. Like, even if they're limited and you're still uncertain about the thing, it's normal. So even if this freak you out, you will be scared, you will be undecided, and that's how it's normal to be. But you should never lose track of them, because that's what you can effectively build something consistent upon, which is not the only way the way you will win, because you don't know, but it's still a good way to tend toward that direction. It doesn't assure you victory, but at the same time it is still, you're grounded. You have to be grounded on the most solid evidence you have, right? And in fact, von Clausewitz says, and on these principles, the opinion in each particular case immediately under consideration lies, as it were, at anchor, right? But to keep to these results of bygone reflection in opposition to the stream of opinions and phenomena which the present brings with it is just a difficulty, right? So we already explained it. You can stick to what seems fairly solid evidence, but still everything is gonna happen. Like, there is this stream of opinions and phenomena, so this mixed, always, here it's crucial to understand that you're constantly in contact with the external, and still most of the problem happens from the within, because in order to come up with an answer, in order to make a decision, to take a decision accordingly, you have to elaborate the state. So you're not just playing the shielding off attacks. You have to take action. You have to be able to assess as much as you can about what's going on, although it's so dramatically difficult because this data keeps pouring in, and you have to constantly review your understanding of the situation. It's very competitive, even as a thinking, right? And I'm talking literally. I mean, think about the headquarters, how much commands are divided sometimes, how many rivalries and disagreements can happen in a place of command. Now, von Clausewitz writes and says, between the particular case and the principle, there is often a wide space which cannot always be traversed on a visible chain of conclusions, and where a certain faith in itself is necessary and a certain amount of skepticism is serviceable. So, this is how the thing is, right? So von Clausewitz is, that's the greatness of von Clausewitz. This is not a manual to win wars. It's just a way to tell you how it works, so that you can know what you can expect and cope with this better. But the problem here is individual responsibility. You have to take that decision alone. And here von Clausewitz pictures brilliantly what you are like. You can't have all these convictions, which are logical chains. Many rings of this chain miss, right? So that you fundamentally don't even know if the whole chain exists in the first place, so that you may be directed towards a completely different direction you didn't expect. And what you need in here is, at the same time, in fact, a certain faith in yourself that is necessary, because otherwise you would be simply frozen. You wouldn't be able to do anything about it. But at the same time, you have always to be skeptical, so that and probably, let's say that having faith in yourself is more important, but still you'd have to trick yourself in the process. So also in here, von Clausewitz is telling you, reality. There are these two extremes. Reality is in the middle ground, and you have to cope with it. And there is no one, though, that can do it at that point but yourself. That's the real point. So that's why you need faith in yourself and skepticism, because otherwise you would say, well, but what do I need this stuff for? Like, it doesn't help me to solve the problem. It actually does, because it doesn't do it directly, but it gives you that best that you can have in order to cope with it. And it's important because it involves feelings. Von Clausewitz has defined that you can't do anything about the fact that there is not a science of war, but to consider at this point what the limits are, because if you are to find a solution, or at least to head towards that direction, because it turns out there's a reciprocity for which at least one of the two has to win, or the two fighters has to win. Well, the idea is better if you look at the limits of human, the human limits in general, and identify those, those characteristics, those features that can help you to cope with it. So one is faith in oneself. Another is also a certain degree of skepticism. That is to say, okay, be confident about what you do, because that is important, especially also when you cope with an enemy. And this is going to have an impact on you, right? It's those laws of reciprocity that von Clausewitz has defined. But also, do not believe too much in what, in fact, you can't see, even though you need this leap of faith to take action in the first place. Always be aware that there is a chance that what you see in the front is wrong, right? And a big deal of the problem is even to assess how much is this chance, right? And even when you have assessed it, you can try and fail still, because that's what the unknown can present you with. So it's a great gamble, of course, but that's where you have to be, able to and stay sharp. It's like a card game. Von Clausewitz compares war to card game in this sense, because you can. There is no way to win. For sure, it depends on luck. It depends on which cards you have been given at the beginning of the game. But then, if you are in that situation, you have to do your best on the basis of what you already know, how that card game works, so that doesn't assure you victory, but still it can make you stay awake enough to seize that opportunity, and hoping that for the enemy to screw up or something. That's really what can make the difference. And it does happen. As a matter of fact, it happens all the time. Also because you do that thing, those mistakes all the time. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, here often nothing else will help us but an imperative maxim which, independent of reflection, at once controls it. That maxim is all doubtful cases to adhere to the first opinion, and not to give it up until a clear conviction of forces us to do so. This is also a very, 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 very important phrase, and it's a great philosophical lesson, because von Clausewitz here, I think he's descending from the mere, here the man is freaking intelligent, and he has made a gigantic effort to present us the thing, so in a clear fashion, so that it makes you understand perfectly how the odds are theoretically it can be, and how the situation is. But he's telling you something very human at the end of the day. He's telling you, there is no way to tell you whether you will succeed or not. But if you really want to take action, you must think in this way. And this way is that just out there, try and get the first impression of it and decide on the base of it. There is no better way, right? Because you're definitely changing opinion as long as it goes on, but still that first impression you got at the beginning is what is the base you have to work. And it's better to work on maybe even a partially incorrect base, which is always the case in war, but not to have any base at all. In this advice contains also this other element, that is, do not give up this opinion, right? Given that that you will be challenged, you will doubt of this choice, you will be let's say swearing for having taken it, but it's your choice. It's based on something. Okay, you may be completely inept, but still that will make difference. The important is you have something to build on, right? It's like when you make a plan. You know that a plan has some risks, but which one is devoid of them? The problem is really understanding, quantifying those risks, and you don't really know about it because it involves too many factors, too many sometimes, and you need this intuition. But the idea here is that you have to continue on that track as long as you don't find enough evidence that really proves, or better, that, because proof here does not quite exist even, it's that really clearly convinces you to change it, to give it up. That's how you should go. And you realize that this is also relative, because what is a clear conviction anyway? And we have seen how troubled and battled and challenged we are all the time in this context. So that's where you need really a strength of character, because without that you can't have the enough intelligence and enough courage to pursue your goal, and you can't fail, you can't fall into the fort, but at least you had a plan on which to do it. You had a track, a narrative, and this is interesting because when you study military history, for example, you realize that it's a bit like this. I mean, obviously military history is way less complicated than actually commanding, as if you were, in that context as well, right? But military history is still talking about war and describing it in all its extremely complicated nature. So by trying to reconstruct, for example, a battle or a campaign, you will be confronted with so many of these problems that you will kind of understand that what matters at the end of the day is having that track in mind, right? The first impression, the idea that, looking at a battle or a campaign, you try to assume fundamentally what was, maybe the good decision and the wrong one, is important to start to interpret it in the first place. Then you can maybe, that's maybe just a hypothesis, you can erase it. Maybe it was wrong, it didn't work. There is other evidence that emerges that basically disproves you, but still you have gained enough understanding from that experience that can help you to understand the world. And it's a progress, and the progress happens through defeat. There can't be any proper progress without defeat. It's not just rhetorical. I mean, it's really true. Because if we weren't used to fail in every single thing we do, and that shows how limited we are at the end of the day, we wouldn't even need to work. Because to make an effort to understand how things are, it would be like in the golden age, right? And it's through the difficulty that we need to find a pattern, and that's how our mind works. It's on the base of patterns that are obviously approximate, are obviously limited, but it's the best thing we have, biologically speaking, in this world to cope with whatever this thing of existence really is. So it's all about choosing that, that path. And that's something, for example, that also my teachers during my university career always, at least the most intelligent one, they always gave you. Not the idea of following them, following the academy, the great historiographical current. No, you have to start from what you truly think, because what you think is important, even if it's wrong, because it's going to be important for you chiefly to grow and to go on. So if you have an intuition, if you have an interest, if you have any particular question, try to find the answer, because that's where it starts from, and it all starts like that. How do you believe we get to know history? How do you think, I don't know what you think about me, but plenty of people ask me, what should I read? I don't know, but because maybe they assume I know who knows what. I really don't, and I think at least it's partly evident. But the concept is start with yourself. It all starts with yourself. Many people need to find the good, the guide, right? There is also a matter of character, of personality. There are people who tend to follow more the others. There are people who are a bit on their own and a bit following others. Then there are people who just really don't want to follow others. They want to do everything by themselves as leading. For example, I think I fit into this. I've never cared or never fully trusted what other people told me. Even though I naturally trusted people, I don't know, my parents, my teachers, people that I obviously estimate and appreciate, but still, to me, everybody's answer has never been sufficient enough, and it was needing to know more, and I had to find that solution, and I had to wonder, where can I find it, and that's how it starts. Because you start very slowly going to search, and you realize, you learn more, realize things are more complicated. So this is a widespread and shared cognitive journey that starts all from yourself. So don't think that there are easy answers, that you can only get to that point, to that line, to that reference to get the whole thing. This is what really too much, even by historians, is done. Always to follow the lead. The lead is important, because if there is a hierarchy in our societies, chances are that, in spite of all faults, it kind of worked. It was kind of the best option, and therefore you need historiography. We need to read what other people think, but everything starts from your own personal curiosity, from your own ability to put yourself into the game. And war is a game. War is defined by Von Clausewitz as a game, and it's really what it is. We have explained that. In other words, you have to take responsibility, because otherwise you're just an avatar of someone else's ideas and thoughts, and it's better that you commit a mistake by yourself than you do it by following someone else's, at least unless it's, the consequences are not overwhelmingly and permanently damaging, which can happen naturally, but it's hardly the case, because even from the most bitter defeats and what you see in history, sometimes even the greatest victories came because they gave the strength, that they changed the mind, and it's right even to make a mistake and to be corrected and to pay fully for it, because then you know what it matters, what it really means, what it takes not to make that mistake ever again. That's learning, that's growing, that's becoming more mature, right? So always bear it in mind. So what Von Clausewitz then goes on and says, we must firmly believe in the superior authority of well-trained maxims, and under the dazzling influence of momentary events not forget that their value is of an inferior stamp, right? So this is the most important thing, is that there is a logic that goes beyond what the minor things can make you believe at the moment, right? There will always be setbacks, right? There will always be things that will make us doubt. But if we had that intuition and we feel that that's the right thing, that you truly believe into it, that you know that you're doing it because you're honest with yourself. You're not doing it to prove something to someone else, but because you really want to solve the problem. You think that that's where the answer lays, or that's at least where you can find something useful in order to solve the problem. Well, just follow it. Don't let yourself being demoralized. Always remain, aware of it. Never that there are things that are gonna bring you down. It's normal. We all pass through it. There are always moments in which you say, I can't take this, I can't do it. But eventually things pass in a way or in another, right? And at the end of the day, if you're still there, when we have passed them, we can understand what it had meant before, and then how we shouldn't be tricked by this experience anymore. And it's very easy to be torn down by such events, right? But the pattern, the maxim is more important. Remember von Clausewitz, always. When he writes, then, by this preference which in doubtful cases we give to first convictions, by adherence to the same our actions acquire that stability and consistency which make up what is called character, right? So that's what really character is about. Don't let you be brought down by the hardships, and yet always be aware that you have nothing but to learn, so that you don't have to stay closed and fanatically take your maxim as if that was the most important thing ever, because if you lose that, you also lose flexibility and you can't cope with this anymore. So stay humble, know that things are gonna be rough, but that you can make it. If you have a good reason, if you have a valid reason, if you have a good motive, good reason for thinking that is right, just test it, right? Because if you want to struggle with it, that's gonna be under test. So that can even fail, and it will fail, but still you will have understood something more. Maybe next time you will not, and you will surely do better, at least in that particular field, hopefully. So it's for Clausewitz writes, it's easy to see how essential a well-balanced mind is to strength of character. Therefore, men of strong minds generally have a great deal of character, right? So this means that having character is really about being smart, being intelligent, being capable of reading things through. Like, being intelligent is many people think that intelligence is like a natural, almost random character that someone has because maybe he's born like that. No, it's never like that. It really comes through exercise all the time. And intelligence is to be developed, is to be cultivated. It's something that has to be the most important driving. It has to be the guide, really, because you're driven by your emotions, by your feelings, what you think is important for you, etc. But it's reason that can show you the way how to achieve your goals. But also you have to have the guts to take a responsibility. You can be the smartest person in the world, but not having the guts to go out there. And you need that. And I know it's hard because everybody likes to stay here just, rambling like I do now every day on this channel, but without doing anything else. But we need to do a lot else to live well, and it takes a lot of conviction to do things that take a long time, or to be constant, and that's where your character is measured, right? You also have to have the courage, the resolution, this particular type of courage that doesn't make you give up, but that helps you to follow on your intuition that is necessary to go on. So if you remain firm, if don't let yourself being overwhelmed by emotions, by these strong impulses that it's very easy to fall prey of, you can really go very, very far. You can achieve lots of results, and then you will have a great deal of character, and you can build that. It's what lots of people, I hate when people are told that they're worthless, that they can't make it, like, because it's, let's be honest, we are kind of evil sometimes. We need to break, to destroy people's images and thoughts and personas, because we makes us feel better, and sometimes for a good reason, right? You don't have to think that everything really comes for evil. People sometimes help others. We have this aggressive, competitive ways, also because that's also what makes society grow. Because if we were let there without no stimulus, without anything, without no need, we wouldn't accomplish anything. Let's be honest about it. Even stinging every once in a while is fine, really. A bit of saying, let's say, healthy dose of aggressiveness, of a competitive mindset, and of even of excess in terms of expressions helps, molding our reality. We can't freeze everything. We have to remain competitive. We have to remain healthily competitive so that we can help each other at the end of the day. Because if you let the person, overly, complaining about, simply backing this whining, the idea, everything is bad, I can't do anything about you, and you say, oh, poor dear, it's someone else's fault of evil people, you're doing damage to that person at a certain point, and by a certain measure is fine. You also have to be kind of supportive and also nice and polite, and you have to help others. It's important, but also you have to toughen them in some measure. You need to make them understand that they can make a change for themselves by themselves, and that just by good words, that will not do. So we all have a potential, and we all have the ability to build up on this. To really make something cool, something great. It's not anecdotal. It's not those motivational speeches you find everywhere that say everything. Yeah, some of them are too pushed, in my opinion. Like saying everybody can literally do literally everything, like becoming the most important. No, well, we also have to be aware of our limits, but within those limits there is a lot we can do, really a lot, and much more than we thought we couldn't do. So we have to be thankful also for these setbacks, for these defeats, because without them we wouldn't know what it takes to earn something and to make a good use of it. But aside from this, that's what character is really about. This great deal of character helps you have a strong mind, and vice versa, right? And they can't exist one without the other. You can't just be a there are many faults in someone's approaches to these topics, like pushing either in one direction or its opposite. No, that you need balance, and you need to know when it's enough, also for yourself, and never presume that reality is just you can just bend reality at your own will without having do anything. Also, you can't just be a mere egocentric person. Like you can't pretend that the world is gonna follow you just for that. Maybe you can't even reach to the top and do something good about it, but still there is a price to pay. So everybody has its own balance at one point, and much of this has also to do with how to find it. Naturally, for what concerns von Clausewitz, this is also and obviously how much this character fits in a position of command. But positions of command are, in everybody's lives, if anything, because we have to command ourselves. So this is a pretty universal message you can draw from the work. Let's talk about the setbacks too, because that's important. Von Clausewitz says force of character leads us to a spurious variety of it, obstinacy. And he writes then, it is often very difficult in concrete cases to say where the one ends and the other begins. On the other hand, it does not seem difficult to determine the difference in idea. So here, just a standard Clausewitzian method, like, here we're not to say in the specific case how you can measure it infinitesimally. You have to just be aware that these two things differ conceptually, and then you can easily identify them. In the first place, it's often the most important thing to do, because who finds out that is obstinate, we would like to insist on it if there wasn't something serious with that. It's a matter of perspective sometimes, and most of the times actually. So von Clausewitz writes, obstinacy is no fault of the understanding, right? It has nothing to do with intelligence proper. He writes, we use the term as denoting a resistance against our better judgment, and it would be inconsistent to charge that to the understanding, as the understanding is the power of judgment, right? So intelligence is this ability of of getting through, of judging correctly, right? And this ability of also, it's power because it's not a force but a power, because it has to be quick and reactive, right? So it has to take less time. So obstinacy is a fault of the feelings or heart. So obstinacy does not derive from intelligence. There is no intelligence in obstinacy in the first place. It's a fault of the feelings. It comes from that, or the heart, right? Von Clausewitz defines it as this inflexibility of will, this impatience of contradiction, which have their origin only in a particular kind of egotism. So a person that is overly concerned about himself, basically, which sets above every other pleasure that of governing both self and others by its own mind alone, right? So it has this, fairly dark side, that he's having this, kind of dictatorial or attitude without, in fact, understanding. The thing is more like an egoistic taste, right, than actual intelligence. In fact, obstinacy is something that is pretty much stigmatized, I would say, in terms of intelligence. Like, yet we are still losing track of it. And this is very important in I think in our times, in terms of discourse and debate, because obstinacy is, with the intensification of feelings importance over reason that appears, because people are generally more ignorant, less capable of understanding, etc. Obstinacy, the appreciation is being shifted from understanding to obstinacy, right? The idea of force of character doesn't mean how much you last, but how much you're able to make an effective judgment, right? And just insisting on your position when you're presented with evidence that is not the case, it's just stupid. But everybody plays that card, because if you fake that, if you act in order to show that it's not the case, the other person, the person that does not understand, will think that maybe you have a strong character, but it's not the case. That you will be followed just by people who are as dumb as you, basically, or less. So that is really a problem. And in debate, it's really intelligence that divorces obstinacy at the end of the day, because intelligence smashes barbarians. Always be aware of this, that intelligence wins over irrationality, wins over instincts, feelings, emotions, passions. Intelligence has an edge over it, and it takes to be really a capable person, not to fail. So someone who is in charge, someone who is, uh, the right person for the task most of the time. So naturally, this can bend to evil as well, especially when you don't really emerge from a particularly bright background of you're surrounded by people who have pretty low understanding as well. But so we should have faith in intelligence and stigmatize obstinacy for what it is. It turns out people who can say, oh well, who cares, are fundamentally, the people who are more confident in themselves, who can overcome difficulties without being brought down at the level of feelings. Because always remember, also in Clausewitzian theory, that the moral resources are the ones that fluctuate the most, that swing the most. So it's very easy to attack on feelings, like insulting someone, attacking his persona, etc. It's very easy, it's very coward-like, but it's gonna backfire. Because if you do that, chances are you're not particularly intelligent. It just takes to find someone who is intelligent to you to pay dearly for it. And it does happen. So this is, in my opinion, one of the reasons why we have survived as a species, in spite of dumb members of of it, in the sense that we have made an improvement, a substantial improvement, and this past as this form of enlightened element over this sea of incompetence, of ignorance, of irrationality that throughout all the ages in history, and that were incidentally the ones that really led society at the end of the day. Because this kind of people, this kind of intelligence, because here von Clausewitz is talking about commanding war, but really, commanding people is not excessively different from a hierarchical point of view in terms of qualities you must have. That's why politics contains a war as an instrument in itself, right? Or at least owns it or has it as as an element of character. So the always, and when you're obstinate as well, if lots of people are telling you, look, you're wrong, like without attacking you personally, without being jerky, well, you should also stay open to it. Like you should always question yourself, like saying, am I doing something wrong? And I can see it. Maybe you should listen to other people as well. But he who has a strong mind and great deal of character is able to spot immediately with taking simply taking advantage of you, of your naivety, let's say, and then you simply don't respond because you know it. And it takes a lot to build something like that. I believe all people do, but reflecting, and this passes through confrontation. You can't have a world into which you're confined into a safe space for which nobody can touch you and pretend to emerge alive from that. History tells you that you're gonna lose, you're gonna disappear, as it's only those who can adapt dynamically that make this improvement can go on. If you remain there, you lose a lot of know-how. You can even read a lot, but if you're not confronted with different ideas, if you don't fight for your ideas, you can't make it. You can't make it alone. So we need other people, even if this doesn't involve necessarily siding just with a side, or having just following someone else's trail, but you need other people to confront what your ideas are, because otherwise your brain simply remains atrophic, doesn't produce much, even if you know much, right? And this has to do also with feelings proper. You can be extremely intelligent, but still being kind of morally to the ground, right? And you know a lot, you understand a lot, you even understand what should be done, but you don't have the strength to take action. That's very sad, by the way, because it does happen. It does happen. There are clinical cases, unfortunately enough, and this is the sad, the scary part of the story, because some of these tendencies evolve over time. There are people who can change over time. You can be permanently damaged by these attitudes, and therefore that's why you shake yourself and to wake yourself up, which is hard, because by nature we're programmed just to fall asleep if we don't get woken up by something else suddenly, right? That's our tendency. That's why also von Clausewitz recognizes that, tendentially we delay problems. We don't want to be confronted with problems. It turns out that doesn't solve the problem, it just makes them augment in number and multiplicate, and then until the point you will be choked by them, and you can't work like that. You're gonna succumb, right? So always on obstinacy, von Clausewitz says we should call it a kind of vanity, were it not decidedly something better. Vanity is satisfied with mere show, but obstinacy rests upon the enjoyment of the thing. Right? So this is a very perverse attitude. That's why some people like it so much. Because you just enjoy being vain. And this is pretty bad. If there's something I don't like, for example, which is kind of bizarre because I'm starting a YouTube channel, is that I hate exhibitionism. In fact, I talk about myself as less as I can, actually, and just try to deliver these contents, obviously adding some form of criticism I can come up with, but always cum grano salis, let's say, and with the awareness that, it's not that you're interested in me, I hope at least, but you're interested in things I say, which is slightly different, right? But importantly different at the same time. So obstinacy is exactly about this. It's about being vain, and being vain is bad. It's really bad. I mean, sometimes it can even boost your moral. Like, if you appreciate yourself, hopefully, that's something positive. But only showing is, if you do only for the sake of it, well, that's sick. And obstinacy is even a more twisted side of the story, because it's just enjoying this continuous show, which is ended to itself, basically. So it's pretty bad in all imaginable ways. And so in conclusion here, von Clausewitz says, we say, therefore, force of character degenerates into obstinacy whenever the resistance to opposing judgments proceeds not from better convictions or a reliance upon a trustworthy maxim, but by a feeling of opposition. From a feeling of opposition, sorry. So this behavior basically stems from the fact that you're being attacked in some way, so that you don't care that you have your maxim, you believe in something, and that you can't stay open to change it, as long as something proves that it was wrong, and therefore you are convinced otherwise. But this is basically, obstinacy is stemming basically from your ego, right? You feel attacked, and therefore you want to insist on that because you don't want to give up, and you just and that backfires, because at the end of the day, if it is evident you're wrong, that is only showing that you're kind of stupid, right? So you don't make definitely a good impression at the end of the day. So then von Clausewitz writes, if this definition, as we have already admitted, is of little assistance practically, still it will prevent obstinacy from being considered merely force of character intensified, whilst it is something essentially different, something which certainly lies close to it and is cognate to it, but is at the same time so little an intensification of it that there are of very obstinate men from want of understanding have very little force of character, right? And this is particularly important. This is a great lesson of life, because here von Clausewitz is telling you that there are people who are incredibly smart but have no character. They're incredibly intelligent but have no character, so that they can't cope with the situation. They can understand things, but they don't have the ability to accept the natural mistakes that everybody does, including themselves, and just insisting on this, right? And so von Clausewitz here rightfully points out that being an obstinate person, a stubborn person, for the sake of itself, is not a proof of character, and but just something different. I mean, something cognate to it. It's interesting how von Clausewitz puts it. Like it definitely has to do in part with your force of character, because obstinate people have this impulse that have to do with what they think it is to be, but that's not really character, right? That's not really character, and on the contrary, obstinacy doesn't prove you're characterially strong. But here, it's interesting, by the way, von Clausewitz says here that this thing is not practically very important, like because things are gonna go very complicated also at the level of human mind, way more than this is the thing. So he tells you, yeah, you know this thing now, so you can distinguish certain ideas, but don't I made some clarity, but don't think that it's that simple. And that's why I think that this phrase is also very important, because it's motivation on itself. Because we all think at some point that we are somehow strong, characterally strong, and therefore in our stubbornness we see kind of this proof of character. Like, I don't care, I will go on, like stoically speaking, right? In front of adversities, I don't care what people believe. But unfortunately, this transforms itself into a parody. I mean, sometimes it is true that that the strength of character is proved by this not losing head, and that's why von Clausewitz here is so important, because this is all about a matter of convictions. And even in real life, I mean in everyday life, not just in war, we have this kind of problem that more than, I personally feel it a lot actually, that people more than interested into reality, they're interested into feelings, in how they perceive something, or how the thing is perceived collectively speaking. Like, for example, when you have a thesis, right, and you want to push it, like you believe it's valid, you want to pursue it, it's very rare, sometimes even for intellectual limits, that this will be understood both by yourself and the others, right? Or maybe that you will not be able to explain it at best. So that there are certain twists that the world situation can take, for which people get convinced that your thesis is wrong. And at that point you have trouble in assessing whether it is true or not. I mean, those people's opinions can really change your mind, can really really affect your mind at all times. So that's when your intelligence as well as courage is going to be tested, and that's where your resolution is going to be tested, because you your strength of character, because strength of character is at the end of the day made up of intelligence and resolution, and it can't work the one without the other. You have to be intelligent enough to understand what is going on, to make correct assessments, and courageous enough to be resolute, to go on in knowing how to follow your ideas into actions, your thoughts into actions. That's vital, and that's like the axis around which you should build everything, because upon which you should build everything, because there is no other way to assess it in the first place. So never think that, especially when you have lots of people that go against you, never think that that is like the end of the story. Just take it, whatever it is, either as the, confirmation that you're doing something right, or maybe the acknowledgement that you're doing something wrong, but that you can assess through these qualities that you have to cultivate. And we all grow through this. It's incredible how accurate von Clausewitz is regarding to these topics. It's so axiomatically. I love von Clausewitz in his the way he really gets it clear. Von Clausewitz is able to surprise you in this way that it's amazing, right? You read all this stuff and you say, oh well, now this is this usual list of things he writes, and who knows what it's complicated. Then you get what it really means, and you say, wow, this thing really works. It's really like that. This can be helpful. It makes me understand a lot about myself. And so a reason more to read this guy, if you're not interested in military history, but this is big, right? This is something that makes the difference. There are lots of people that are hungry for these thoughts, for this encouragement, for this lucidity. And von Clausewitz is great because it doesn't he doesn't do it for proving anything at the end of the day. He does it for making things work well. And you are the one who's gonna make them work. It's not gonna save you with just by intelligence. In fact, that's what we are already setting here. You can be very intelligent, even understanding von Clausewitz very, very well, but having no force of character to put into practice what he taught you. And chances are that if you really understood him, well, you're probably very, you're aware. You start being aware of this. You start maybe being more confident about yourself to lack that courage that you to compensate for that courage that you lack, and build that together with your intelligence. Or otherwise, maybe you're a very particularly courageous person, but you don't feel to be intelligent enough. So and I must say that I was thinking which one of the two I can identify more in, but I must say that at different levels, naturally things are not perfectly balanced, but these are things I wonder, I don't really know, but I think at a certain level we all lack a bit of the things. We are all enough intelligent to realize we need to be more courageous on certain stuff, and we're all enough courageous to realize we need to be more intelligent on certain stuff. And these things are, you can't separate them, right? That's when it really works, to make them work, to use them together. But anyhow, today I thought this would have been much longer, but turns out it's pretty interesting. It was fairly contained at the end of the day. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.